For the last 25 years, skills development has largely been off the development agenda. In the 1980s into the 1990s, as the argument for primary education rose, there was an argument that rates of return to education showed that vocational education training didn't work. But late 80s and into the 90s, we also got an argument that public vocational education training was particularly problematic, was inefficient, was poor quality, etc. So really in the Education for All Millennium Development Goal period, vocational education training was off the agenda. With the post-2015 Agenda of Sustainable Development Goals, we can see that vocational education training has come back onto agenda as part of a broader view of what development is and where education plays in it. So it seems a good moment to think, what is it that we might want to be doing in this sector from a development perspective, and particularly from a British perspective? Although Britain has not been a major development player in skills for the last 25 years, curiously, it has been one of the most influential countries in the field through other mechanisms. So let's look a little at what Britain has been doing to see whether that might be a model for what DFID might be interested in doing. The first thing is that a lot of what has been done could be classified as fairly traditional technical assistance, working with public institutions to develop their management systems, etc. Now those things are fine, but they're not likely to be a major priority. However, the other thing that is of much more interest is that Britain has been at the centre of what can be called a governance turn in thinking about vocational education training and skills development more generally. What I mean by this is really three elements. First, a focus on national qualifications frameworks and national qualification systems. Second, a focus on national and sectoral skills councils. And third, new mechanisms and regimes for funding and for quality assurance. But I want to urge caution on this. But the first thing there is I need to have a little aside about the evidence. DFID, quite rightly, is concerned about evidence-based policy. However, what we have in this area is lots of policy and hardly any evidence. So we have lots of advocacy, 100 or more countries adopting ideas where actually the evidential base is very, very weak. So what I want to do is think about this a bit more carefully, and in the reading guide I look at a series of papers that start to try and unpick this, typically done in the response to policy initiatives to analyse how well they've worked, what are the problems with them. So theoretically the approach starts from a view that current vocational skills systems are failing. Depending on the theoretical angle, this is because of market failure or it's a lack of good institutions. But whichever of those two we take, and in fact we probably want to combine the two, there's a general story that training regimes in most countries are not working effectively, so we need something different. The solution itself has theoretical attraction. It's certainly a lot better than where we were. But I want to raise 5 questions about the extent to which this is a valid solution. And in a sense here I'm influenced by a notion of the theory of change that's operating here. So the first thing is, okay, we've analysed that there's a problem. And in fact the problems are very major in many skills systems. You know, we have very weak institutions, we have massive market failure, we have inadequate funding, we have low trust. We have a range of things that suggest we have a major problem. Okay, so how do we get from having major problems to this model which is talking about major new systems that are going to solve the problem? In getting from here to there, we need to think about what are the current problems in systems, how can these be overcome? What are the political and economic factors that may limit the chances of change? Okay, the second thing we need to think about, and I'm using National Qualification Frameworks in particular, is the issue of information. So the argument is that there are asymmetries of information, and this particularly affects poor people, and it particularly affects employers who don't know the skills that workers are, or potential workers have, and are trying to get into the labour market. Okay, those are both points with validity. However, it's very important to ask, Might there be a reason why we have these asymmetries of information? May they actually be in the interest of some people? And if we look at a lot of the economic literature about training markets and their failures, of course there's an argument that it may actually be quite useful for employers that they know what skills their workers have, they know how their workers are contributing to productivity, but the worker doesn't fully know and other employers don't know. This means that they can depress workers' wages and not risk losing them to other employers. So there are actually good arguments for employers to not have full market information here, because this allows them to make a greater gap between productivity and wages and therefore make more profits. So perversely, having more information might actually lead to a depression of training volumes, because if workers are able to push their wages up because they know better what they're worth, then employers have less incentive to train potentially. But also it increases the likelihood of poaching. And one of the classic arguments within the economic literature about skills is that there's a disincentive to train often, because it makes more sense to poach workers that have already been trained by someone else, that they've put the investment in and you reap the benefits. So that's our second problem. Our third, and I want to look particularly at skills systems now, comes about the scope of change. So a lot of what's been done here is to say we have dysfunctional national skills systems. This has been done in a position taken in Britain, taken in South Africa for instance. We've got a dysfunctional national skills system, so what we need is a system of sectoral skills bodies across the whole economy. However, the evidence from Britain, from South Africa, from other places is that results in uneven performance. Some sectoral skills bodies perform much better than others. It seems very difficult to get them all working at the same time. However, this very much is a theory of change issue. It's a theory that because we've got this problem across the economy, it's best to work across the whole economy at the same time. However, if we look back into development economic theory, and particularly go back to the work of Hirschman, Hirschman's argument was in countries that were struggling to develop, what they precisely didn't have was a capacity to develop across all sectors. And then it made more sense to focus on sectors that were dynamic, to build change in one sector or a small number of sectors that would then generate change across the economy. So we essentially have a disagreement of theory here. Do we go universal and maybe end up with unevenness, or do we go for an evenness in the first place and hope that that will spread out to other sectors? So there's a big question about the theory here. Clearly the approach which says go to all sectors isn't working, so would it be better to go for key export sectors, for instance, or key new technological sectors? The fourth issue is thinking about these systems as complex systems, and therefore sequencing becomes a key issue. The country that's held out as the best example often in literature here is Scotland. But of course Scotland is small, is developed, is not an aided country. So we have to think about the capacity of other states to get that sequencing right, particularly when they are being driven quite heavily by the cycles of development assistance. So there's a big question about which parts of this complex system do you work on at which moment in time. A bit like the work across all sectors, do you try and do everything at the same time, or do you do certain things which then lead on to others? It's a very complex system, and we don't have a good model of how this works across all sectors. So the fifth issue I want to raise is that of evidence. So I've already said that we have a problem at the research level, that we have little evidence about what works and what doesn't work here. But when thinking about interventions, we also have a problem of evidence. Part of this comes down to what information would we need to know that it's worth investing in a programme, but also what information would allow us to know whether a programme was succeeding or not. So part of the challenge here is that actually these complex systems are built out of political compromises. Often they're built with a language, therefore, that offers many things to many people, but is quite vague on what actually the system is supposed to be achieving. For instance, on National Qualification Frameworks, We often have a complex language that is talking certain things to employers, it's talking about migration, it's talking about the poor, it's talking about equity, and it actually becomes quite difficult to see what the objectives of the system are, what are the key performance indicators. When we were doing work for SADC and UNESCO, one thing we did in looking at how skills systems were being reformed was we asked countries, stakeholders in countries, to judge their systems, their qualifications frameworks, their sector skills councils, etc., how, on a scale of 1 to 5, how well did they think they were doing, and then to ask them for the evidence. And what we found fascinating there was we tended to find quite high ratings, we're doing really well, but when we asked what was the evidence, it would generally be that we had a policy document, or even worse, we were talking about having a policy document. So having the document became the evidence for having achieved something, rather than anything that really talked about impact or outcomes. And so I think if we are going to move towards following the British trend of influencing the world systems here, and move that into what DFID might do, we've got to think very carefully about these 5 issues and how we would work out whether it is worth to invest in these things and when it might be time to pull the plug on programs because they're simply not working.